So welcome to everyone once again to our digital think tank, where we're presenting a number of short papers by some really brilliant independent scholars that we've all brought together for you today to present on some various topics to do with queerness and antiquity. First up for us all this evening, we have Marcus. So Marcus Agostini is an independent scholar based in Rome. His scholarly interests include masculinity, queer sexuality, and the late Roman Republic. He has a background in film and media studies and is currently pursuing a classics degree at the American University in Rome. So I'm very thrilled to present Marcus today for you, and I hope you will enjoy his paper very much.
So since the moment of his death in 30th century BC in Alexandria, the body of Marcus Antonius has been the site of interrogation and negotiation about sexuality, gender, and performative masculinity. This is because of two main reasons. First of all, because this is how the political propaganda in Rome worked. And secondly, because oftentimes historiography is bent on the outcome of a struggle, and Mark Antony has lost notoriously. However, what I really found interesting is that this loss is oftentimes connected to the way in which Antony performed gender and how transgressive it was in this. So this has brought us centuries of social cultural anxieties all projected onto one figure. But why was his figure so divisive, and why Cicero calls him Rome's own Eden of Troy? Well, first of all, we have to understand who is Antony. We have basically nothing that is ever written because Damnatio Memoriae made sure to wipe everything away. However, what we do know, thanks to coins and reports, is the way in which he mythologized himself and the figures that he decided to pick as his main gods and heroes. First of all, we have Hercules. Now, it is important to understand that in the late Roman Republic, the elite oftentimes associated themselves with mythological figures, gods and goddesses, to be more powerful in the public sphere. For example, Caesar pretended to be descending from Venus. Well, the Antoni did the same, and they said that they were descending from Hercules. But why is Hercules important in terms of gender and sexuality here? Because Hercules is one of those heroes that has several stories that play around the gender binary. Here, as we can read in this passage from the Fasti by Ovid, there's the story of Hercules and Omphale, which was a Eastern queen that bewitched him. So again, this is a similarity with the way in which people said that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony. And to share each other love, they exchange clothes. Here it says, she gives him dainty Gaetulian purple frocks, gives him the stylish belt she just worn. His belly exceeds the belt. He unclasps the frocks so his massive hands can be inserted. He shattered the bracelets and craft for his arms. His huge feet split her tiny shoes open. She in turn takes the heavy club and lion skin and the smaller shaft stowed in their quiver. So of course, we can see why Antony's detractor could use this as a way to criticize him. And there's famously a cult dedicated to Hercules where men dressed as women. And there's also another cult where men often dressed as women that belongs to probably the most famous god in Greek mythology that plays with the gender binary, which is Dionysus. But why did Antony pick him and not Bacchus, which is the Roman version of the god? Well, a lot of things get lost in the translation between Dionysus and Bacchus, and Antony wanted to preserve them. So Dionysus is the god, as I said, of the gender playing and all that is not really Roman. He was brought up by his aunt Ino as a girl. He's often compared to a girl in many plays that is written on him. For example, the Bacchae, as you can see here, Pentheus is comparing him to a girl. He says, "So you are attractive, stranger, at least to women, which explains, I think, your presence here in Thebes. Your curls are long. You do not wrestle, I take it. And what fair skin you have. You must take care of it. No daylight complexion. No, it comes from the night when you haunt Aphrodite with your beauty." Antony was so fascinated by Dionysus that even in his coin, as you can see there, he represented all of his symbols and he was wearing the crown. And Plutarch, in his Life of Antony, also says that when Antony came to Ephesus to meet Cleopatra, the celebration for it was a real bacchanal. There were women dressing up, dancing, drinking wine, men and boys dressed as satyrs and pans really made their way into the city. Of course, this didn't really match with the way Romans perceived masculinity and gender. Now, it is important to say that the Augustan propaganda is what we know that pretty much criticized Antony wholeheartedly. But we do not have to say blame everything on it, because even prior to Augustan propaganda, Antony has always been other from gender and masculinity the Roman way. But of course, the Augustan propaganda played a huge role. Here, as you can see, are the 12 main sins that Augustus ascribed to Antony and that are present in attacks, in speeches, that we will see even later. We have alcohol abuse, licentiousness, tearful despair, consuming love, feminized dress, political inability, abandonment of Rome, absence of his children, infantilization, unpredictable behavior, Antony presenting himself as a gift to Cleopatra, and all these comparisons to other male figures as the embodiment of appropriate masculinity. But why was masculinity so important in Rome? Well, that's because to be a man, and especially a man in the politics, you needed to have certain qualities, because all the public sphere was connected to masculinity, while the private sphere was seen as more feminine. So to be a man in Rome, you just didn't really need like the right genitalia, but you needed a certain type of behavior that was ascribed into virtus. Virtus is an umbrella term that we can divide in two main topics. First off, you need to possess pudicitia, which is essentially a Roman sexual virtue, and it refers both to sexual modesty and sexual integrity. The opposite of that is mollitia, and being accused of that was really huge in ancient Rome. The term comes from molles, which is soft, and it represented a softness of the soul and sometimes even of the body. Secondly, you needed to possess continentia, which is self-control or restraint towards the physical and spiritual matters. Of course, the opposite of that is incontinentia, which is the lack of self-control and the proclivity to be ruled by external factors. Now, of course, if we can take the list before, we can see how Antony was often accused of both mollitia and incontinentia. This is, again, because the Roman political invective pretty much based all the public sphere of Rome into the masculine gender, while the private was more feminine. So Antony likened to dress up as Hercules or Dionysus, loving perfumes, loving the East, and being interested in jewels, was seen as something that was different from what usually men portrayed. Furthermore, he was later on associated with Egypt, and Egypt was also associated with this kind of feminine sphere that Romans need to conquer. But as Brett Carroll says perfectly in his Masculinity, an Historical Encyclopedia, all there was about the myth of the man in Rome circled around hegemonic masculinity that comes again way back and that we're still fighting today. So the Romans saw the archetype of the hero warrior as the perfect example of how man should be. Here says, the hero projects strength, virility, control, power, and dominance. It has historically been used to create social and cultural norms of manhood, defined by characteristics of race, white, class, wealthy, and physical stature, grand. All of these traits exist as ideals of the form to which men of all backgrounds should aspire. Now, it's interesting to notice how Antony does indeed have many of these characteristics, because He is white, he is wealthy, and he has a grand physical stature. However, both primary sources and scholars use this characteristic not to ascribe Antony into the group, but to underline everything else that he lacks. Now, of course, the topic wouldn't be complete without mentioning probably the biggest work that goes against Antony in ancient Rome, which is the Philippics. The Philippics are a series of 14 speeches, all addressed to Antony directly, that pretty much were trying to annihilate his person in the public sphere. What is really interesting here is the way in which Cicero uses gendered terms to describe him. The most famous speeches of all is the second one, and this is what I'm going to read. You, Antony, put on a man's toga, which you immediately made womanly. At first, you advertised yourself as a whore. The fee of your shame was fixed, and it was not small. So, aside from being, an attack on him and compared him to a prostitute, which was, of course, someone who lacked virtues, according to Cicero, the important word here to be seen as muliebrem, which means womanish and effeminate, and especially scortum, which is a word that refers to prostitute, but it's not a male prostitute. It's specifically a female one. And here it continues. Your life from a boy showed that you would submit to anything and you would be a slave easily. Again, the comparison to a slave, of course, implies that he had no virtue. But the important thing here is the use of the term paterere, which comes from pater, and it means broadly to suffer and to endure. However, in this case, it's specifically used to underline the fact that Antony endures a sexual submissive role and that he likes it. Now, the problem in ancient Rome wasn't really who you went to bed with. The concept of sexuality is really hard to ascribe into that time period. However, what was important was the role that you had in the bedroom. If you were the active role, it was perfectly fine. But if you were passive, then the problem started to arise because you were then accused of molitia, and this was a big no-no in ancient times. Now, what is really interesting in Cicero and in general in the mythology of Antony is the way in which one or two particular figures are described. The first one is Curio. Curio is Gaius Scribonius Curio, and he is a minor political figure in the late Roman Republic, but also the rumored boyfriend of Antony in his youth. What I found really interesting here is the way in which the major source on Antony, Cicero, portrays this relationship, and then the other major source that we have, Plutarch, portrays it. Plutarch comes way after all this event took place. He's an historiographer and is not under the influence of the Augustan propaganda. So they have a really interesting take on this figure in particular. Cicero in his Philippics says, Curio quickly intervened. We took you away from the occupation of prostitution, and as so he had given you a gown, he had really arranged a steady marriage. And more, no boy, both for the reason of lust, has ever been in the power of his master as you are in Curio's. So again, Cicero is pretty much saying that Curio saved Antony and that Antony was his mistress. However, the words here again really hold a particular importance, because meretricium comes from meretrix and it's female prostitute, and also the mention of a stola, which was a feminine gown, is really telling, of course. A small note, the in matrimonio stabili is one of the first mention of same-sex marriage in Latin literature. So, Plutarch, however, says a completely different things about Curio. So he says, Antony gave brilliant promise in his youth. They say, until his intimate friendship with Curio fell upon him like a pest. For Curio himself was unrestrained in his pleasure, and in order to make Antony more manageable, engaged him in drinking bouts and with women and in immoderate and extravagant expenditure. What I find really interesting, aside from the completely different version of this particular story, is the way in which scholars deal with Curio. Most of the times they take Cicero at face value and they do not go further than that. Other times they completely obfuscate his figure, saying that Cicero was probably exaggerating everything that he said and that we shouldn't really care about this on Antony specifically. This treatment is also something that scholars do, especially on another figure in Antony's life, which is Fulvia, his second wife. According to Latin sources, Fulvia was female only in name, because she was really the political mastermind behind everything that Antony has ever done, politically speaking, especially after the death of Caesar. Now, Cicero, of course, exemplifies how Antony was submitting to her in a really derogatory way. Was it in order that the woman, Fulvia, might enjoy the surprise of seeing a catamite like you when you had shown yourself unexpectedly? Now, catamite comes from catamachus, which is a corrupt collaborative form of Ganymedes, and it was a derogatory way to address men who liked other men. Plutarch, however, has a softer version of this. He says, therefore, Cleopatra was indebted to Fulvia for teaching Antony to endure a woman's way, since she took him over quite tamed and schooled at the outset to obey women. So, of course, both of them are saying that Antony submitted to women, but that he loved doing so. And Plutarch has more nuance to that than Cicero, but many scholars focus only on one version of it. Now, of course, this whole introduction brings to us with how we see Antony nowadays in modern representation, both books, movies, shows, and everything else. Here I picked 4 main movies and shows that have Antony in it. And I want to first make clear that none of them are really focusing on him specifically. He is always the second in command or the person that gets bewitched by Cleopatra or in an ensemble cast. It's never really about him. What is really important, however, and what all these stories and all these media have in common is the way in which there's something that lacks from Antony narrative that is really telling, I think. So everything else is present. We have the lasciviousness, we have the drunkenness, we have the bouts of emotions. What we do not have is Curio, or any mention of the ways in which Antony diverted from regular, straight masculinity in Rome. Now, of course, this can be ascribed again to hegemonic masculinity, especially the 20th century movies, books, and everything else that was produced with the Hays Code, with the fact that it was really hard to portray this kind of relationship on screen, and also with the fact that sometimes the otherness was, especially in epic togas, connected to this diversion from the main path. For example, we have Crassus and Spartacus as an example of that. It was really hard for producers to portray Antony in such a way, because of course, even in those productions, Antony was not the man that, for example, Caesar was. But the audience still needs someone to latch onto, especially after Caesar dies. So of course, you couldn't have Antony being completely otherized. You needed some sort of partly me reaction from the audience. And of course, a male audience, which was the target of many epic toga movies, would never try to associate themselves with someone that is not straight. What is really interesting, however, is that even in the most recent representation of Antony, for example, in HBO Rome, there's basically no mention of it at all. And HBO is notorious for dealing with concepts that are really more heavy than a simple queer relationship. However, there's just like a blink and you missed it note on season 2, episode 7, where Atya, a character from the show, says, I insist you sell your slave, male or female, who you previously fucked. So this is literally the only mention that we have, nothing else. Of course, this is because, and Mike Donaldson puts it perfectly in what is hegemonic masculinity, heterosexuality and homophobia are basically the bedrock of hegemonic masculinity. A culturally idealized form, it is both a personal and a collective project. While centrally connected with the institution of male dominance, not all men practice it to most benefit from it. And hegemonic masculinity is also what is behind Antony's dyadic interaction with literally every other man in shows, books, movies, you name it. I made a grid here and I picked just 2 movies, 1 miniseries, and 1 show. And Antony is always in opposition to what means to be a man. Most of the times, this man is Caesar, sometimes is Rufio, which is his second in command, and in Rome is Vorenus, which is a soldier, despite all his flaws, is identified as the real man and underlines the ways in which Antony is not. So where does this leave us? It leads us to a creation of a myth that is really not about Antony and a lot more about Romans and what masculinity meant. And since Antony has never been the front center of anything, he's always been the footnote at the end of an history book or in relation, second in command to someone else, nobody really paid attention to him as a person. The late Roman Republic and the fall of the Republic really has no interest, apparently the scholars have no interest in exploring issues of gender and sexuality at all. So all this entire part of Antony gets discarded, obfuscated, or considered not important. Now we have all seen around social media how people say their historiographers try to hide the queer relationship, to hide the gays. Well, I don't want to be that. I don't want this myth to be perpetrated. I want to study Antony for who he was and understand why he was this way, why he was considered such a threat to Roman masculinity, and why that didn't stop him. He never tried to conform to what people wanted from him. He always and constantly challenged masculinity, challenged gender. And I think that this is finally the time to understand this part of him and to finally give him the focus that he deserves. And I hope that with this paper, I've interested you enough to join me in this quest in trying to understand the real person. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation from Marcus D'Agostini talking on When Antony Was Queer, Sexuality and Gender Representations of Mark Antony from Cicero to HBO's Rome. If you have enjoyed this think tank and would like to see more, please consider following us on our social media pages, which you can see on screen now. Thanks everyone.